Good afternoon, everyone, and happy Halloween, happy Day of the Dead. Erica Griffin, Community and Public Engagement Manager at the Chicago History Museum. So, joining us today for our conversation, we have our moderator, Dr. Stanford Carpenter. Stanford is a cultural anthropologist, also a comic scholar. We're joined by my dear colleague, Julius Jones, who is a PhD candidate in history at the University of Chicago and also an assistant curator at the Chicago History Museum. We are joined by Scott Jordan, who is chair of psychology at Illinois State University, and also Nia Easley, who is a lecturer and artist at the School of the Art Institute. I am going to start off with a poll question. I would like to see just how much you all know about the show and the history that's portrayed. So we're going to go ahead and pull up our first question. So the question asks, Uncle George, who is one of those main characters, was developing a fictional safe Negro travel guide, which is sort of a nod and homage to the very real Negro motorist or Negro traveler's Green Book. And the question asks, were Chicago businesses listed in the Green Book publication? So for the most part, the Green Book series were developed to indicate where African American people could receive safe service, lodgings without issue. It also listed African American businesses and so forth. And many travelers would certainly use them as they traveled across the American South. But was Chicago also listed? Chicago places and spaces within the Green Book. And I will give us just 2 more seconds to answer that question. And we will share our results. So most of you say yes, 58% say yes, 15% say no, and 27% were unsure. And that answer is actually yes. Chicago, although it is in the North and segregation policies were not mandated by law, it was still very clear that Chicago existed under a de facto set of segregationist policies and practices. So although, when you think of Green Book, you think of traveling across the South, traveling in the North was no less difficult, was no less challenging for African American motorists and travelers. And so the Green Book really gave a snapshot into this entire country and where those areas of safety, those communities of safety existed for African American people. So with that, I will turn our Green Book conversation over to our moderator, Stanford.
Thank you, Erica. Yes, one thing that was really great about Lovecraft Country is the way in which it takes some seemingly very ordinary things in everyday life of African Americans and imprints it and brings a new consideration of it through the horror genre. So, for example, we have the Green Book, which is designed to articulate where the safe spaces are to travel, where the places are that you can rest your head. And what's the first thing they do? What's the first thing that happens is Tick comes to Chicago. We meet George, and they go on a road trip, and we start to see like the horrors of what happens when you go to the wrong place. And even when the first monsters are introduced, it's introduced when they go into the wrong place. And this is actually a very interesting way in which horror functions. Horror usually centers around cultural boundaries, whether it's just really entirely imaginary or they can actually be physical boundaries that we apply definitions to. You should be here, you should not be there. But before I ramble on, Julius, could you give us a little more information about the Green Books?
The Green Books were really part of, as Erica's introduction alluded to, really part of the ability to travel across the country safely for African Americans. Not only was this country riddled with sundown towns, but even in cities such as Chicago, which you may think as northern and not sort of infected with Jim Crow racism, you would have areas and places and communities where people wanted to be to avoid having African Americans frequent. So the Green Book put a positive spin on this and often sort of admonish people that they can sort of avoid the pitfalls of running into um, you know, the embarrassment or even the potential violence of going into a place of business that was unaccommodating to African Americans. So the Green Book almost existed like as a sort of directory, right? And it would have addresses and phone numbers and listings of businesses that had been vetted to make sure that they did in fact accommodate African Americans. And it was financed by these businesses placing advertisements, right? So you would essentially advertise telling African American travelers, please do come to my restaurant, to my service station, to my hotel or motel. You are welcome. You will be safe from any sort of harm or racism or prejudice in my business. And so, and these things were published for many years, well through the 1960s. So for a long time, people were sort of mindful of this need for this type of publication. There were competitor publications as well. And we've actually seen in recent times, in light of some of the events related to, you know, the shopping well while black or bird watching while black movement, that we see a renaissance of green book like publications, where people are sort of again being compelled to advise African Americans and other people of color about places where they can go and recreate and shop, and restaurants that will be accommodating to them again. So, in a lot of ways, this phenomenon is becoming full circle.
I mean, I think that that's one thing that's really interesting is the Green Book as, you know, it's for commerce, but there's also something about it where it makes me think of you know, those old fashioned maps where you see the sea and it's got like a whole bunch of like dragons and stuff like that. Like you go over there, something bad happens. And Lovecraft Country picked up on that, right? By creating these maps where you had like this hooded figure with a scythe. If you went to this particular area, kind of indicating the danger. I mean, I'm really interested in how how these types of things, you know, have almost a policing aspect on ourselves, right? I mean, Scott, what are your thoughts on what something like the Green Book does to how someone conceptualizes their place in the world?
Thank you for asking. Everybody in the audience, you see the pictures on the screen, see our faces, you hear these voices, and that may be what you feel you're experiencing. But if you pay a bit deeper attention, you'll also see there's a profound sense of here and now. Your body is here and now watching this. And that is a sort of what I'll call presence that underlies all of our experiences of the world. We carry that presence with us, we carry it with our bodies, and it's the background against which things in the world can be foregrounded. So, in a sense, when you create a space like the Green Book, you're well, looking at the images in front of you right now, for example, there's a sort of, I would say, I'm going to use the word rupture. It sounds bizarre, but my current presence is suddenly now disturbed in the sense that I'm kind of booted out of just being here and now and actually placed in a space by the image of the Green Book that sort of makes this moment bigger than just now. And I think if one uses something like the Green Book and actually, dare I say, maintains their presence safely as they travel with it, the image of the book itself can actually come to, in a sense, evoke a sense of presence bigger than just where you are at that moment. That's the value of artifacts. That's why we have pictures of our loved ones all over our home and in our wallets and in our phones now. But we carry these things with us. We put them in our world to sort of establish our sense of place, bigger than just ourselves at the moment.
And that's interesting that you bring up artifacts. I mean, I think this is, I mean, you know, in terms of what we do, how we interact with them, right? Nia, you've done some really interesting artwork and art projects in relationship to the Green Book and the travel guides. Could you talk a little bit of that, please?
Absolutely. I was researching the Negro Motorist Green Book, I came across it myself back in 2015, reading Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns. She doesn't even call it out by name. She mentions a green paperback guidebook that listed lodgings by city or state. And I was intrigued and wanted to learn more. And so I was able to access green books through the New York Public Library. They had put high def scans online. And I started visiting all of the Chicago listings that were in there. And it quickly became apparent to me that a lot was not listed. So I started hunting around and looking for things that um, might have existed in the early half of the 19th century, early half of the 20th century. And I stumbled upon a blurb about my own neighborhood. I live on the northwest side of Chicago now in Avondale. And this is from before the Green Books were published, but it was still shocking to me to discover that there was an African-American community on the northwest side of Chicago in the last quarter of the 19th century. And I ended up making a whole project about that. It has to do with belonging and placemaking. And what led me to this discovery was just a mention on the Avondale Neighborhood Association, like history of the neighborhood. They mentioned that there was an AME church. Well, if there's an AME church, and you know what that means, an African Methodist Episcopal church, then there must have been a community to support it. And then I stumbled upon this map. What we see on the screen right now in that top left corner is a composite map. After doing much more research, the black half of the map, the darker half of the map, is based on a drawn it's like a map of Avondale as it was in the 1880s, as it was remembered by a member of that community. And he points out a colored section. And that's really it. He just calls it the colored section. You see the Colored People's Church, but he doesn't really name people. And upon further research, I discovered through the help of John Cameron that the majority of the reason for that community there was a man named John Brown Dawson, and he isn't even really called out on that the drawn map that was a memory of how it was in the 1880s. So the composite shows the Dawson subdivision as it was mentioned in insurance maps from the time, right? Because they kept very good records. So yeah, it was all kind of serendipitous and really interesting. And people are still contacting me about this community that existed and mostly dissipated by the 1920s.
One thing that I and our audience is intrigued about is the way the Green Book was portrayed. In particular, we were introduced to it very early on. And I also think it's interesting, like even as we talk about how it delineated spaces, is that there was work involved in creating these green books, and that was one of the things they really tapped. I thought that they tapped very well for the horror, right? That in order to figure out where the safe spaces are, you have to get in a car and drive to the places where the spaces are not safe to verify that, well, something bad could happen to you there, which sounds trite in the saying in the present, but in the reality of that past, right? Something bad happening is you not coming home at all, right? And then also the way they portray hazards, right? Being pulled over by a police officer is a hazard because they might take you away. They'll take you away and you won't be found, right? But I'd love to hear some more thoughts from all three of you about what struck you about the way the Green Book was portrayed, and the concepts of the Green Book were portrayed in the series Lovecraft Country.
I particularly liked Hippolyta's contribution to the Green Book, and not to become too poetic, but Hippolyta's the one in the episode I Am who basically gets to this space where not only is she quote unquote safe, it's her space, and she names herself. So I don't think it's an accident that we start with the Green Book. It's very geographically located and very much in a building, then on the road, then out to Artem. And over a series of episodes, we're basically in this space of place of possibility that Hippolyta discovers. And I just think that transformation from the local to the global was really well handled. And I just love how that worked out.
I agree, Scott. I think that the way they kind of situate us in the 50s, starting with George and Hippolyta talking about creating this guide, and also the way, if people choose to do more research into the things that inspired the world building of the show, you learn that Victor and his wife Alma really worked very closely on developing that guide.
Right.
And so having Hippolyta and George is this nice counterpoint.
Yeah, I would just go on to add, the Green Book is sort of it's a business, right? And we sort of because it's such a vital sort of need of ensuring, bodily integrity and safety, but also demarcating possibilities, right? As you see the characters on the show, they are planning their route based on what the Green Book is sort of, or the Green Book equivalent is sort of guiding them through, sort of allowing them to say, you can go here, you will be safe, you will avoid those hazards and pitfalls that Stanford spoke to, and you can sort of then have the possibility of safe passage and also enjoyable passage, right? This idea of sort of what does it mean as an African American to sort of be able to safely recreate, right? To sort of, we sort of take some of those things for granted, but in reality, right, the sort of specter of just being out and enjoying yourself and then having violence, the potential of violence to be met upon you is something that I think the show does really well, right, and sort of saying like these moments where people are able to find reprieve safely, and they're facilitated by the guidebook, which is exactly how it would happen in real life. You could plan your family reunion, your summer vacation, and your travel based on this guidebook.
And it's interesting how the guidebook itself gives the landscape almost a mythological quality, which is where the horror seeps in, right? And in many ways, the horror of Lovecraft Country very much is racism, right? It's you're traveling along, you're minding your own business, and it just kind of bubbles up. And we see that perfectly represented in the first creature we run into, the Shoggoth, right? It just comes up from underground, and it's just tears people apart. And then if you happen to survive, you get turned into one. So this idea of this emerging malignance that both kills and transforms. I can only take that so far. Do you guys have any thoughts about that?
I do think there's an interesting. I remember seeing the map, and Dee had written monsters on the map, monster faces and such. And so on the one hand, that's a traditional Lovecraftian approach to horror, is to create these unknown beings that are out to get us. And the true horror of the Green Book is that they're not unknown beings, they're other human beings, right? And they can do horrible things. So I personally appreciated how the original book and then the series took this sort of Lovecraftian notion of otherness in terms of cosmic otherness, and turned it on its head and say, no, we don't need to go cosmic to find trauma and to find horror. It's right here. Unknown horrors living in plain sight is the way I like to talk about it.
There is that scene where they're kind of jumping across the country, investigating places to see if they should be included in the guidebook, really, and end up in Simmonsville. And that's where the restaurant no longer has the name that they knew it by, but they decide to eat there anyway. And Tick realizes it's painted white inside because there had been a fire. That is a horrible thing to encounter, and all too possible at the time, right?
I mean, that's one of the things that got me about this. It actually brought me back to every road trip that I went on as a kid, right? And think, and actually thinking about my past differently, in terms of, oh, maybe, but yeah, I mean, and I think one of the things that's also really interesting about the way Lovecraft Country starts with a road trip. It's like they go across, they go across the country, they go to Artem, and they come back, and they end up right back in Chicago, and we find out that, or it's driven home to us that Chicago is not a safe place. Bronzeville may be a safe neighborhood, but Chicago, while not being a sundown town per se, contains a lot of sundown neighborhoods, and I think that's where I think it's really interesting to talk about the Winthrop House. I think Erica might have something for us about the Winthrop House.
This question speaks to just what Stanford is talking about, this idea of movement and place and sectioning of people along color lines. So the question that we have here speaks to the Winthrop House, as you said, and Letty moving into this North Side area. So again, she's taking her Black self and inserting it into this area where she is not exactly welcome. Do we know what episode that was? What episode did Letty move to this Winthrop House? So we'll give it just a few more seconds, see what we get. Looks like a lot of you have watched the show, which is good to see. All right, so we will end it there. And that was episode 3. So in episode 3, you had Letty and all of her art friends coming up to the North Side, where they were certainly unwelcomed by the residents around them. And, for the most part, in and around, the Great Migration through to the 50s, you had African American people living in pockets that were heavily populated by other African American people, but there were some instances where you would find, Black people outside of those boxes, but they still found a way to bring themselves together and galvanize around space. And that brings us, Stanford, to the 4600 block of North Winthrop. Julius, if you could you give us just a bit of historical framing around that story of the 4600 block of Winthrop related to African American populations in Chicago?
So my colleague Brittany Hutchison spoke to this in our previous panel virtual tour, and she really did a great job of laying out how the 4600 block of Winthrop represented these sort of quasi peculiar spaces where you would have African American enclaves interspersed throughout traditionally what we conceptualize as white areas of Chicago. So it was not common, but it was also not unheard of to have these small communities of a block or maybe even two where African Americans would live together and find refuge amongst one another. There was one in Lincoln Park neighborhood for many years, as well, African American church that just recently moved within the last year because they had been sort of serving this small African American community for over 100 years in that area. So all throughout Chicago, we see these small sort of African American enclaves that really sort of spoke to what does it mean to sort of find yourself out of your quote unquote place, especially as the rise of sort of residential segregation begins to close in and prescribe African Americans into Bronzeville neighborhood, throughout the first half of the 20th century, to sort of be African American and find yourself moving into one of these neighborhoods or trying to hold on to one of these enclaves, small racial enclaves, was really to sort of find yourself on the precipice of potential for conflict, potential for harm, potential for violence. When African Americans attempted to move into historically white areas, it was not uncommon for them to have violence met upon them. Bombings were a common refrain, and in this instance, show, you see a cross burning take place to sort of way in which to demarcate that she, as a Black person, is not welcome in this space.
And it's also kind of interesting because there's a very I find that there'd be a really amazing interplay between this notion of being out of place, but also still tethered to a previous place and tethered to memory. But first, would what for those of you who were here for the virtual tour earlier, you already know this, but they refer to the house as the Winthrop House, right? That she purchased this house. It's called the Winthrop House. Well, that references the 4600 block of Winthrop Avenue in Chicago, and that is known as one of the one of the first white neighborhoods to have African Americans move there, because during the Great Migration, what happened is pretty much almost all the African Americans moved to Bronzeville, and Bronzeville became this little mini metropolis, this mini black metropolis within Chicago. And the other neighborhoods were not welcome spaces, and especially when you get that far north, because that is that's pretty far north. It's it it the fact that her going there is not the safest thing to do. What's interesting is when she gets there, she finds that the house is haunted. Right, it's haunted by the ghosts of people of black people who've been experimented on by a white University of Chicago professor in the basement. And I always find that interesting, because there's a sense to me that it's a historical reference, but it also is like history as coming into the present, and also it's tied to memory. And I'd love to open up the conversation to that a little bit.
This idea of having your place, and that starts with your body and then extends out to the world. The Green Book took that across the country. In this particular episode, when Letty gets that house, now it's in a borderland space, if you like, right? It's potentially, as you said, a dangerous space. And this, for me, this is where the show sort of needed to go to eventually get to the types of things we saw at the end of the show. You can't escape memory; you live in it, and it actually it amplifies the meaning of moments in ways that we often can't predict. And so that home, Gil Scott Heron living there, heck, I mean, all those great sorts of things were right at the, if you like, the hinterland or the border of the hinterland, and so there's a place for a lot of tension, also a lot of place for change, right? The change requires that sort of interface. So I thought that was made sense they did that way.
Yeah, I also really sort of like the idea as a historian, as history as haunting, right? As history as sort of being something that is always ever present, right? And always sort of not only sort of merely you have to be cognizant of, but it's actually sort of affecting and shaping your material reality, right? And so the Winthrop House is a powerful metaphor for this, because as Scott pointed out, it is what has happened in this space that causes the haunting to occur, that is now affecting Letty and the other residents of the house, right? So they are being shaped by the past, and we sort of see this play out. I was giving a presentation about sort of the history of redlining in Chicago, and thinking about racial discrimination, and really driving home the point that in some ways, while these practices may have ended, or at least be less prevalent, they still haunt us, right? They still shape us, they still define us, we still live in their legacy. And I think that the show sort of really sort of created a powerful metaphor, not only of Winthrop, but so many other historical events that it covered.
Absolutely. The one of the strengths of the show, I think, is using the genre of horror, right? It gives them a lot of leeway to express the traces of that have been left by this very real violence that we experienced in the past. When Letty moves into that Winthrop house, they make mention of Trumbull Park, which was an actual example of when families moved in and experienced bombing and arrests and extreme violence. And when you look at Chicago, not just the redlining, things like the expressway were used to block people into areas and create this geography that made those divisions very rigid and very real. And so even if today we don't experience that sort of division isn't legislated, it can be felt. Even if you don't know like why you're feeling that way, you feel it because there are traces left in the areas that we still live in.
It's like, yeah, I mean, and what I think is also interesting is that what gets driven home is that she goes to Winthrop, and it's not safe outside, right? The cross burns everything, and it's not safe inside either, because that's where the ghosts are, right? But ultimately, at the end, she doesn't just it's not about exorcising all the demons, right? It's about exorcising the demon of the man who did the experiments, with the help of the ghosts that were the remnants of the experiments, right? And I thought that was like just a brilliant stroke in terms of using horror to not just show trauma, but to show the different ways in which you deal with different kinds of trauma. That there are some traumas that it's about, you just need to cast it out, right? But then there are other traumas where it's like where you work with it and you need to heal, right? And I felt that was one thing that was really interesting, that this idea that not every ghost is something to be smited, that sometimes it's about healing.
Yeah, I really enjoyed. I think Letty moves into the borderlands, and then, as you said, she finds out that the home inside isn't safe, and so she goes into the spiritual borderlands with the help of a priestess. And suddenly, at the end, I felt like Letty became a conjurer. I mean, she's the one who takes the spirits and brings them into the present by saying, "You're not dead yet," right? And so, in that moment, Letty's presence is not only just local; it's also more global and more historical. And she's basically, as you said, healing, providing a space by confronting the borderlands and not avoiding them, and actually being knee deep in them. And I just thought that was probably one of my favorite scenes of the whole series, to be honest, is that basement scene. That was just stunning.
And what's interesting is, by the end, you've also established another border, right? Where in the process they have created sort of this magical border around there that prevents, for instance, Christine and the police chief from entering, right? It's like it's like this protective border. And I'm really interested in that concept of borders, not just in terms of the Winthrop house, but taking it back a little bit to the way they portrayed Bronzeville itself, right? It's this, like I said, it's like the safety that's created there in community, in numbers. I think that's something else that's really interesting, is that this shows different ways in which safety is created. But I'd like to hear more from the three of you about that.
Safety is created by what we wear, what we say, what we buy. The way we live our life sustains the borders of the life we live. We don't experience ourselves living that way often, but I would argue part of the issue we face culture right now is that um, a lot of white America actually doesn't feel itself as being racist, yet it continues to live a life that gives rise to all these sustained borders that no one's consciously well, not no one, I shouldn't say that, some aren't working to sustain. So I would argue living is part of being alive, is this generation and sustainment of borders. And um, seeing things that way takes for me, takes you out of your own head a little bit, and makes you look at the world that you're living every day actually keeps going. So no, I'm very much into the idea of borders and how we do this work of making the world a certain way so we can be a certain type of someone.
Yeah, I mean, one of I think the most powerful messages of the show, and I think it sort of, you know, is brought to bear in our contemporary reality, and piggybacks on what Scott was speaking to, is this idea that to be black in our society is to be unable to be safe, right? It is to sort of be in sort of perpetual danger, right? To sort of be perpetually available for racialized violence to be met against you, right? And so, what you sort of see the show sort of grapple with is how do people sort of try to live in the context of that perpetual danger, a danger that does not appear to be going away anytime soon in our contemporary reality, right? And so so much of the stories from the publication of the guidebook to the Winter Home to the way in which Emmett Till is sort of played, even the sort of genre of horror itself, that you literally are in perpetual danger. And I think that is a allegory for what it means to be a person of African descent in the United States. It is to sort of find yourself in perpetual danger for a racialized violence that is met against you for no other reason than the color of your skin.
Absolutely, Julius. And the one of the ways the show kind of works with that too and plays with that, and the way it plays out in our everyday lives, is that it becomes part of the familiar and part of just is like the everyday reality, which is also very horrifying
Yes.
to know that this terror can just come out of nowhere.
One of the
And,
things that I really
and
liked that they did in this show is when the priestess put the mark on the door, the power of that mark never left. Anytime that episodes later, when Lancaster tries to come into the house, the power of that mark still works. That what's brilliant about that is just the power of history, right? This is our power, is our lived life and our collective memory, and it will protect us. I just thought that was, and it wasn't overemphasized. It's just little things that happened here and there that I thought were really, really smart.
well, it's also interesting. I mean, what Nia brought up earlier about like terror being everywhere, right? And then Scott, what you're talking about in terms of like creating these things that last, right? And then I was also thinking about Julius, talking about all this economic activity, but back to the terror, right? I mean, in this show, we actually have references to the ultimate terror, which is that you can build all of that, and that the act of building, the act of creating something wonderful is what draws the attention that destroys it. And we see that the most in references to the 1919 Red Summer dotted throughout there, and then also in the episode where they go back to Tulsa, to be there on the day that there's the race riot in which there's a massacre that wipes out this incredibly well known, very successful Black community.
Mhm. Absolutely. We often hear a lot in our sort of public discourse about, the racial wealth gap, and people sort of pointing to policies that have led to that, socioeconomic phenomenon. But one of the things that I believe is underreported is the way in which African Americans who attempted to build wealth and economic bases historically have been met with violence and have those efforts thwarted, right? And so one of the reasons why we see a wealth gap amongst people is that attempts to create wealth amongst African Americans have often been perceived as threats, and thus they have had violence met against them to essentially destroy those wealth building efforts. And so that is the story of Tulsa. That's the story of the Chicago race riot. Rosewood, another story where and even Ida B. Wells Barnett, before she was exiled from the South to Chicago, wrote in her manifesto about lynching that what was at the heart of this was essentially a kind of economic and material jealousy, right? That as African Americans sought to build wealth and achieved success as entrepreneurs, they were targeted for violence, and many of the excuses that we heard were subterfuge, right? Like they weren't true, right? It was that these African American men and sometimes women had achieved a level of material success and prosperity that made them be perceived as a threat, and thus again made them available for racialized violence.
And one of the things that kind of adds to the horror is that, you know, when you have when you have material excess, right, you can do things to enjoy a better life. You can do things like you can travel. And I'm particularly thinking about how it's very much a vicious cycle, right? Right. You work, you create a better life for yourself. And in the instance of this, it makes reference to another horrifying event, which is Emmett Till, right? We were introduced to Emmett Till as a child, and in one episode they make reference to him going on a trip to visit relatives down south, and he doesn't come back alive, right? And I think that's kind of the to me that's kind of taking this all full circle. It's like no matter what you do, the horror is waiting for you. Um, I really would love to talk more about this, but I also want to give us some time for questions. So yeah, I'd love to hear if the three of you have any like final thoughts on that, and then we'll just go straight to questions.
Your point about doing the work to make yourself safe as a community being the very thing that actually um, draws the anger and then the violence. Um, that's a stunningly well made point. And for me, and you brought up you brought up Tulsa. Episode 9, as you and I've talked about before, episode 9, Rewind 1921, for me was really bordered on the sacred. The final scene where Montrose's presence has been totally disrupted. He's completely relived his trauma by watching his young friend be shot in the face, right? And then now he's looking down at burning Tulsa, and he starts to say the names of those who were murdered. And then you have this opera in the background. And these are the types of things that happen in religious ceremonies. And what those do is they disrupt our presence in the moment. They put us into a state of what I would call a state of transcendence, where our current state is not about this place now, but a larger place called history, a larger place called eternity. It depends on, what you're doing in the ritual. But then behind him, as he's doing this, uh, Hippolytus got the portal pulsating, and the portal is the door to all possibility. And then you go through the portal, and Hippolytus, she's exerting every ounce of strength. She's totally becoming, I'm going to get the first name wrong because they didn't put it in front of me. I'm going to say it wrong. She becomes the superhero that Dee wrote in her comic books. And then she ends up saving them all, creating a space possibility through her effort that in the end saves Dee and then saves them all. Just for me, an incredible achievement that took 9 episodes to get to make it that good. Stunningly well done.
And that's the beauty of the storytelling. Nia, do you have any last thoughts before we go to Q&A?
I mean, Stanford, I have a ton of thoughts. I think we should go to Q&A. I guess what I would say is that there's no shortage of these examples of success in history, of Black excellence. You can see layered throughout the show with the quotes and the poetry and the music and the references, and then the show itself. And so kind of I'm left with, where do we go from here, right?
Well, I echo that, but we do know on this panel we go to Q&A. The question is, the thing Lovecraft Country does for me as a white Englishman, obviously that's not me, is make so real the horror of being a Black American in this period. Do you also find this much more terrifying than the Shoggoths?
Yes, these cosmic creatures were created by Lovecraft. How much privilege do you have to create fictional horror? Right? In other words, to be able to live in a place where you're writing about cosmic things that are going to come and destroy us, when in fact there are people your very life is keeping in a space that's horrifying them, right?
Yeah.
Just the sort of blinders that you have to have on to be able to generate that kind of fiction. This book and this project, this TV series did a really, really good job of pointing out what quote unquote real horror is, and the, the the privilege of authorship.
Julius, your take on the Shoggoths?
Well, I mean, there's sort of a paradox about this, because on the one hand, certainly this sort of metaphor for the sort of pervasiveness of racism. But as I said, when we were preparing for this conversation, what is more horror than racism? What is sort of more, even in a lot of ways, um, almost sort of not just irrational, but sort of arbitrary, right? To sort of, and much in the same way these creatures can sort of emerge from the ground, racism can sort of emerge in the most benign and innocuous opportunities to create the specter for harm, for people who is perpetrated against. And I just started thinking about the gentleman who was bird watching in Central Park, only to sort of have the police called on him and be lied upon for some behavior that he was not engaged in. So I mean, in that same way, these sort of mythical characters sort of appearing from the ground, but racism sort of works the same way. It sort of appears in the seemingly benign or innocuous events of reality.
And here's another question. I would like to hear more about the ways in which space and place can rewrite or craft a new memory, or how the show as a media venue and horror genre works to create new memory today. Nia, what are your thoughts on that?
Space and place creating, I mean, as I mentioned before, there are traces, I think, in places of things that have happened and people that have been there. Very kind of maybe benign seeming example of this is the names of streets, right? Up here in Avondale, there is a street named after the Reverend Dawson. And many people who live on that street didn't even know that until I started giving these tours and talking to a lot of them. But and then in many other, like in the show, they mention right off the bat, when Tick wakes up on the bus, we're crossing a bridge named after another white slave owner. Like, I guess the way that we've crafted our own spaces, because people build cities. And so all of the other psychological aspects that go into our social lives come through in these cities too. And what was
Wow.
the second part of that question?
The second, how the show as a media venue and horror genre works to create a new memory today.
It depends on what you think memory is, right? If you think memory is like what you have on your computer, where you have these place codes for information, or if you think that memory is lived life. And I prefer to think of memory as lived life and still presenced, right? And so now we're taking our experiences of history of this show and creating a different presence right now. And the more we do this, the more we change the context within which everybody's presence expresses itself. So as you know, I'm all about pop culture. I think the best narratives we're hearing as a culture right now are coming out of pop culture, and the complexities they address and they afford a space for us to have conversations about. That just changes everyone's presence and makes everything, I would argue, more sophisticated and more informed and more other oriented, which I think is an achievement.
And here's one. I think it's basically a yes or no question. One of the members of the audience asked, "Isn't it true that Black people would pack food in empty jars to relieve themselves on the road instead of potentially meeting danger?" The answer is yes. But I think that also sets up some of the other questions that we have, because that's a very concrete thing that kind of highlights the ways in which travel is transformed, right? By the level of danger. How you can mark your privilege by how well you relate to that comment. But one of the other questions is, can anyone speak to racism as a manifestor of social pathologies today, alcoholism, drug abuse, child abuse, in both the Black and white communities?
How much time do you have? I
I mean,
mean, if we're allowed to talk about these things, if you look what's happening, the de-infrastructure, defunding of civic infrastructure over the past 40 years, we've seen a total dehumanization of our culture. The very system by which middle class America used to get its piece of pie was the union system, which is basically gone. And when you start reorganizing infrastructure in that way, uh, the irony is because it's driven by entities called corporations that don't have an
right.
identity but have the same rights as an individual. You have a sort of blameless pathology. Uh,
Well,
Basically, go
yeah,
ahead.
you're
No,
right. You're right. And that's one of the tricks of horror, right? In the way in which it can in the way in which it can embody, right?
yeah.
In the form of monster or some of these landscapes. Julius, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think we sort of see every day in our society so much despair, and it's sort of paradoxical because a show like a Lovecraft Country, which is sort of um, you know, is on one hand a work of fiction, but it's sort of a historical fiction in a lot of ways, as it's sort of bringing in really a lot of real of these examples brought to bear. And I saw someone also ask, mention these sort of Watchmen and Get Out, these other sort of fictionalized stories. It is the fiction lies genres that allow us to talk about this very real material reality, which is the sort of depth of despair in our country because of the state of our um of our society, right? And so everything from mass incarceration to chronic un and underemployment to the opioid crisis and deindustrialization and the decline in manufacturing and blue collar work, all of these things are creating a whole sort of system of despair, and these things are hidden from the vast majority of Americans' purview, and you only sort of get to talk about how this despair can manifest itself when you're sort of speaking in fictionalized genres.
I mean, I agree wholeheartedly with what Julius and Scott have said. I would just add that these those issues that lead to that sort of despair, this sort of blame on the individual for not being able to make it through all of these pitfalls that are kind of set up, is then also layered on top of the structures and the way that we're organized, which was sort of the logic behind it was racism, right? So the segregated cities and towns, and it it's intersectional, is what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
And this actually leads into the next question, which is can anyone speak to the white children who are indoctrinated into terroristic behaviors and the brutalized black children who were victims and how they pass on behaviors, leaving communities with what? More horror. I know that's a mouthful, but yeah, what thoughts do we have on this?
What I'll say quickly is that there is no genetic plan for who you're going to become. You become an embodiment of the context in which you find yourself and the context in which you push yourself. And when you're a young, vulnerable child, you don't have the means or the self pushing uh, skills yet to escape a space where, when you're old enough, you might recognize was indoctrinating you into these dehumanizing racist beliefs. So then there becomes it becomes an issue for you to experience that as wrong, experience that as whatever word we want to use, and to push yourself to change, to push yourself not to fall into the trap of where you were, how you were raised. And there are huge individual differences in all of that. So a culture of terror sustains itself by producing kids that are terrorists, and only by perturbating the system, can that change?
What relationships, here's another question. What relationships can be made with the Green Book, the underground, in this question, Douglas Williams asks, starts to compare it to the Underground Railroad and travel today. So how would you relate those concepts?
I think the connection perhaps to the Underground Railroad and the Green Book, for me, just conceptually is very strong already. You had people who were trying to travel across the country, perhaps for different motivations, perhaps not. And prior to the Green Book being published, there were some other guides around, like there's a blue book that existed. There were a couple newspapers that would publish things, but it was all word of mouth, right? And you see this with the Underground Railroad. There are songs and like a lot of secrecy because you're trying to protect people. So one of the aspects of the Green Book to me that is interesting is that it was sold at gas stations. And it was definitely a part of this motor culture, kind of trying to appeal to this middle class aspirational Black community, as at the same time as providing this safety. And so maybe that aspect of it ties more to travel now. Julius shared a link about a contemporary version of the Green Book that instead of listing places, instead of listing places that are safe, lists incidents of violence towards Black people in various cities so that you can gauge for yourself how comfortable you feel going there. Because another reason I approached my project the way I did, I had started with this idea that I would make a Green Book, but I found the notion of trying to tell people where they would be safe so impossible. Because even if I walk into a place, being lighter skinned, being a woman, I can't tell someone else that they're going to be safe there, right? So.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of ways you sort of see people still longing to be safe and still sort of carrying on the spirit of the Green Book and trying to communicate, if nothing else, their own personal experiences. So you can see modern sort of versions of this sort of saying about different incidents. You also sort of see people sort of encouraging people to travel to certain places, all of which sort of predicated on the idea of, trying to move freely and safely in embodied Blackness. And I think that unfortunately is something that I don't see changing in the foreseeable future. I think people of African descent are always going to have to be conscious and more so of how they move and occupy space.
That's a good note to end on. Thank you all so much for taking the time. Thank you, everyone who took the time to register to come and hear us talk, and thank you, fellow panelists, for also taking the time and allowing yourself to be in the hot spot. And thank you, Erica, for all the stuff you're doing for us behind the scenes.
Thank you. And thank you all, Scott and Stanford and Nia and Julius, for participating today. This was a conversation that I was definitely looking forward to, and you all were awesome and amazing as always. I hope to see you soon. And until then, stay safe and be well. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.